All right, well, good morning. Go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12. We are finally out of the foundation chapters. It took us a few weeks. It took us almost 9 weeks to get through 11 chapters, but really those first 11 chapters of Genesis are absolutely foundational to our faith. We saw many different origins. I mean, this is the book of Genesis. This is the book of beginnings. And within that, we've seen so many origins. We've seen the origin of man. We've seen the origin of the universe. We've seen the origin of sin and death and corruption. We've seen the origin of language. Last week, when we looked at the Tower of Babel, we saw mankind's lifespan becoming shorter, where once it was 900 plus years, now it's becoming much, much shorter to 500 years and 400 years, and even less than that. We then talked about this man Nimrod, who shows up in the genealogies of Genesis chapter 10, and how he established the kingdom at Babel, which then God gives a brief description of that kingdom and how it came to be, where these people of the earth got together in this plain, and they decided they were going to build themselves a city and build themselves a tower so that they would not be scattered over the face of the planet, so that they would not be a divided people group, and how everyone spoke the same language. Everyone spoke the same language until God, looking down, said, all right, I'm going to go ahead and confuse their language. And again, we might look at that and say, well, why would God do such a thing? Why would he punish man in such a way? But remember, this whole ordeal, this whole building of the tower was a symbol of man's rebellion to God. And by preventing mankind from building this tower, God is preventing them from making a bigger mistake than they would have. And sometimes we don't realize it, but when there's chastisement, when there's discipline, that simply serves to protect us from a greater evil further down the road. I cannot tell you the number of times that growing up, and I was being disciplined for something by my parents, maybe for telling a little white lie, or for, striking out at my brother in anger, and getting disciplined for it, and thinking, why? It's not that big of a deal, only to realize as I've gotten older that, sin doesn't get any smaller.
Amen.
And so those disciplines that my parents gave to me when I was younger helped me from preventing a much bigger mistake as I was older. And so God here disciplines mankind in a way that, it divided mankind. Scientific advancement stopped. The people had to move over the face of the earth. But it did prevent them from making a far bigger mistake. And so now God then takes the camera of the Word of God, and where it once was kind of focused on the whole world, he now zooms in. And for the rest of this book, the last 38 chapters, we're going to be focused in on one family. So where at once we were focused on the entire earth, we're now going to focus in on one family and the promises that God is going to bring to the world through that one family. So Genesis chapter 12, we're going to start reading in verse 1. It said, "Now the Lord had said unto Abram," if you remember in chapter 11, we ended chapter 11 talking about a man named Terah who had 3 sons, Abram, Nahor, and Haran, and they leave Ur, and they end up in I forget exactly. Haran, excuse me. They leave Ur, they end up in Haran. So God comes to Abram at Haran. He says, "Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed." So Terah and his family leave. They come to Haran, and there in Haran they stop. And so then God comes to Abram, where previously Terah had left. Now the responsibility of getting to Palestine is that of Abram. And so we have this Abrahamic promise that is given. God makes a promise to Abram. He says, I will make of thee a great nation and bless thee. So first of all, God would show him a land. Okay, he says, get thee out of thy country unto a land that I will show you. He didn't say this is where you're going to go. He didn't give him, directions or a printout or, hand him a GPS and say this is where you're going to go. He just said, look, I want you to leave and I'm going to show you a land. So that's the first part of the promise. He would show Abram a land. God would make Abram into a great nation. Basically, a lot of people were going to come from this family. Now, God makes this promise, but it should lead us to think back to Genesis 11, verse 30, where it says, Sarai, Abram's wife, was barren. She had no child. So, God tells Abram, I'm going to make of you a great nation, but he doesn't have any children. So this is yet another promise. He didn't have a child that he could lean on for this promise. Just like God didn't give him any directions or tell him the name of the land where he was going for him to lean on that. In the same way, God says, I'm going to make you a great nation, and Abram doesn't have a son to lean on for that promise. He only has one source to lean on. He can only lean on God at this point. Amen. He can't say, oh, well, God told me the name of this land, so I'll just keep reading the newspaper until I read that it's good enough for me to go in there and then I'll set up everything. He can't do that. Amen. He doesn't have a son. He can't look at his son and be like, oh, well, this must be the son that God is going to give me a great nation through. He has nothing. And so he can only lean on God through this promise. The next part of the promise, God would bless Abram and make his name great. It says, I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I don't know exactly how well known Abram was, but he had left Ur. They came to Haran, where likely they knew nobody. So his family had just restarted, and here God is saying you're going to have to restart again. You're going to have to go to a place where nobody's going to know you. So he has to lean on God for that promise as well. And then this last part is the part that a lot of people tend to focus on, this verse 3 where it says, I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So God promises Abram that anyone who blessed him, whether by helping him along his journey, being kind to him, speaking kindly of him, they would also be blessed. And that anyone that rejected him, anyone that turned him away, anyone that did not treat him in a manner that was respectful or hospitable, God would curse them as well. And then he says, in thee all the families of the earth shall be blessed. This is one could almost say this is the second time that the gospel is given. The first time was in Genesis chapter 3, where God tells the serpent, the seed of the woman is going to crush your head. And here he tells Abram, all the families of the earth are going to be blessed because of you. And we know that happened because it is through the line of Abraham that we would get the Messiah. Amen. And so all the families of the earth would be blessed because of Abram and his faithfulness. And so with that being said, we can also go back and talk about the bless them that bless thee and curse them that curseth thee, and also see how that correlates to the gospel as well, because the Bible talks about blaspheming the Holy Spirit as being an unpardonable sin. And certainly we receive the Holy Spirit because of Jesus Christ, who came from the line of Abraham. And so in this way also, we get a much bigger picture. So we have an immediate picture, sure. Those here at this time who would bless Abram and who would curse him would receive the same in kind, but in a much bigger scale, on a much bigger picture, those who accept Jesus Christ, who is from the lineage of Abraham, they would also be blessed. We who have accepted Jesus Christ, we will be blessed. And those who have rejected Jesus Christ, they will be cursed. And there are others who also talk about how even in modern day, those who support the nation of Israel, God would bless, and those who would curse the nation of Israel will also be cursed. And certainly one could make application there as well. But in the immediate, God just tells them, look, anyone who blesses you, those who help you, I'll bless them. Those who curse you, those who reject you, I'm going to curse them also. But there was one stipulation to this promise. Abraham had to do something. Abraham had to get out of his country.
Yeah.
He had to leave his family. It says, "Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation." He had to leave, so he does. Verse 4, "So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot," that would be his nephew, from his brother Haran, for whom the land was named. And Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. Okay, this kind of drives home even further the point that he has no son to lean on for this promise that God makes him of being a great nation. He's 75 years old. His wife has no child. So he has to take all this on faith. He's an old man. Remember, lifespans have shortened at this point. If we were still in the 900-year lifespan, 75, I mean, he's still just a child. But we're not there anymore. Now we're at lifespans that are 120 years or less. So, by all intents and purposes, as we see these family lines get shorter and shorter, as we see these lifespans get shorter and shorter, I'm sure Abram reaches 75 and he's like, I don't think I have that much time left. And here God comes and gives him a promise, but he says, okay, I'll go. And so he goes. He leaves everything that he knows. He leaves it behind again for a second time. Abram took Sarah, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan. And into the land of Canaan they came. And Abram passed through the land unto the place of Sychem, unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land. And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, Unto thy seed will I give this land. And there he, Abram, builded an altar unto the Lord, who appeared unto him. So God keeps up his end of the promise as he always does, and he says, this is the land. This is what you and your family are going to inherit. Okay, and I'm sure Abram builds an altar out of thankfulness to God, but notice verse 6 at the very end, it says, and the Canaanite was then in the land. It wasn't just a land free for the taking. There were already people who were there.
Amen.
And I'm sure that left Abram with questions. It doesn't say that he had any questions at this point, but he can't settle down. He can't. He's still a stranger in this land that God said, this is your land. He is still a complete stranger to this. Verse 8, he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Hai on the east. And there he builded an altar unto the Lord, and called up the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south. So Abram obeys God. He goes, God shows him the land, and he builds an altar to worship God. But he's still a nomad. He still can't settle down. He's still a stranger in this land that he's been given. But all is not perfect. All is not sunshine and roses, you might say. Verse 10, there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. So at this point we have a famine that occurs, and so Abram makes a journey to Egypt. Now, I've done some research during this time period. It's what in history sometimes gets called the Bronze Age, because that was the primary metal that was used during this time. And it's kind of during this time period that we see a lot of upheavals that begin to happen. You have these great civilizations being born. You have the Sumerian civilization in Ur that Abram came out of. You have the Egyptian civilization, of course, that he goes to. I'm sure the Phoenicians at this point, the great traders of the ancient world, start making their presence known. And so you have these great civilizations that are being built up, but historians and archaeologists who study through this time period talk about how during this time period or towards the end of this time period that we call the Bronze Age, there was a great upheaval as strangers started coming in. People that none of these great kingdoms knew about started coming in from other areas, and you started having these famines and other things that took these otherwise great and mighty civilizations and brought them to their knees, to the point where in a few hundred years they're just not going to exist anymore, and new kingdoms are going to rise up. And so this is kind of the start of that, where these famines start to kind of shake the land and start to shake things up and start to weaken these great civilizations. Now, why? You would think Abram is probably got a lot of questions again in his head. He comes to this promised land. God said, this is the land that you're going to have. This is the land where you're going to make a great nation. And all of a sudden, famine. There's no food for him and his family and his flocks. And so he moves out. He goes down to Egypt. Now, I don't know if this is disobedience. I'm not going to sit here and make a judgment call and say that Abram is showing a lack of faith by going to Egypt. I think he's just doing his best to provide for his family. This wouldn't be the first time that someone in Abram's family would go to Egypt to provide. And so I don't think necessarily here that this is a lack of faith on Abram's part, although certainly a lack of faith is about to be shown. It came to pass when he come near to enter into Egypt, he said unto Sarai his wife, Behold, I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. She must have been, because, bear in mind, she's, how much younger was she? She was like 10 years younger. So she's in her 60s. And Abram here is concerned. And I don't think here that this, I'm not trying to say that, he was unfair in his judgment. Remember, people are living a long period of time. If people are living 120 years, she's lived half her life. She's still, I guess one could say, almost in her prime, or maybe just slightly past it. I don't know. But Abram looks at his wife and he says, you're beautiful. And that's a good thing. But he then turns that compliment into almost an insult by saying, Therefore it shall come to pass when the Egyptians shall see thee, that they shall say, This is his wife, and they will kill me. He takes this thing, he says, you are a fair woman, and then turns it into a negative. I'm going to walk in there, and they're going to all kill me for you. This is a lack of faith on Abram's part, for sure. I forgot to move the slides forward. A famine drives them southward from Canaan into Egypt. And so for sure, this is a lack of faith. Again, Egypt is turning into a great empire at this time. I don't know if there had been events prior to this that made Abram think that this might be a possibility. I know that in some cultures, especially some of the nomadic cultures, it was often common for nomadic tribes to steal women for their wives. I know that was something that was common in Mongol culture in the Far East, where they would come in and they would attack a neighboring tribe and capture the women and use them for wives. That's not really recorded ever about the Egyptians doing such things. So there may have been instances while Abram was passing through Canaan that people had tried to steal Sarah before. I don't know. But he looks at his wife, he says, you're beautiful, and because you're beautiful, they're going to kill me to steal you. And so he tells her, instead of trusting in God, because remember, God had made him a promise, I will make of you a great nation. That promise still hasn't been fulfilled yet. He fulfilled one part of the promise. He showed him a land, but there's still so many other promises that have yet to be fulfilled. And rather than leaning on those promises and saying, well, God is still going to provide me a great nation, he decides to take matters into his own hands and commit his protection into his own hands and says, just tell them you're my sister. Which, it was not a complete and total lie. Genesis chapter 20, Abram does the same thing again, which we'll talk about when we get to Genesis 20, but there he says, I didn't tell you, let's just look at it because Scripture speaks best for itself. Genesis chapter 20, we'll come to this chapter a little bit later on. So he goes to Gerar, and there the king of Gerar, Abimelech, takes, he tells Sarah, say, my sister. Abimelech takes Sarah to be his wife. Abimelech finds out the hard way through a dream that he married someone who was already married. And let's see here. Where was it? Verse 11. Abraham said, because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. And yet indeed she is my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. So Abram married his half-sister, which, again, during that time was a little bit more common. Certainly these days we would frown upon such practices, but back then, and certainly in some other cultures, half-siblings, because they're not full-blooded siblings, in some cultures it was considered okay to marry. So he's not telling Sarah to tell a complete lie, but he is telling her to withhold the truth to save his own skin. And I sometimes wonder what was going through Sarah's head. Surely she could not have been 100% on board with this. I mean, she did it. She did say that and we talk about how Sarah did respect Abram and how she did what he asked. But at the same time, I can't help but wonder what her position and what her thought was on this, as she is putting herself in a compromising position to save her husband's skin. And I don't know. Maybe she did it out of a heart of love. Maybe she did it because that's what was expected of her. I do not know. But he tells her, just say that you're my sister, and he attempts to protect himself through this. And so, say I pray thee, thou art my sister, that it may be well with me for thy sake, and my soul shall live because of thee. So not only is Abram showing a lack of trust in God's promise, this is almost quite selfish of him, at least the way I'm reading it. There's a lot of first-person personal pronouns in that sentence, my, me, etc. This ends up damaging his testimony. And it is true that dishonesty is a sure way to get people to reject the gospel that you represent. It came to pass that when Abram was coming to Egypt, the Egyptians beheld a woman, that she was very fair. The princes also of Pharaoh saw her and commended her before Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house, and he entreated Abram well for her sake. And he had sheep and oxen and he-asses and men-servants and maidservants and she-asses and camels. So he welcomes Sarah in because she is beautiful. And again, I don't think this is, we kind of joke around about how she is in her 60s, but I mean, the lifespan of man is still somewhat longer than it is today. And so I'm sure, when she was looked on, she was well looked upon. I'm sure there were a lot of people wondering, wait a second, she's in her 60s, she's this beautiful, and she's not married? Man, Abram, where have you been hiding her? And so she's brought into Pharaoh's house, and Pharaoh treats Abram well for it. And the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this that thou hast done to me? Why didst thou not tell me that she was thy wife? Why saidst thou, she is my sister? So I might have taken her to me to wife. Now therefore, behold thy wife, take her and go thy way. And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away, and his wife, and all that he had. I mean, this is one of those sad moments where a hasty decision made out of fear ends up ruining testimony. The Egyptians were not God-fearing people. They had their own pantheon at this point of gods. They had hundreds of gods. They had gods for everything. And this could have been a wonderful moment for Abram to talk to them about Jehovah God, to say, look, I came out of Ur, and I went to another land, and God Jehovah called me from Haran, and he made these promises to me, and he showed me a land. And yeah, right now there's a famine. I'm here because I can't support my family. And he could have gone and talked to them about the God of the Bible, and who knows how history could have changed if Abram had done the right thing here, but he didn't. And so because Pharaoh was about to make the sin of marrying another man's wife, God plagues the household for it, and this causes Pharaoh to go to Abram and say, "Why did you do this? Why did you lie to me?" And he kicks him out of the country. He says, "Look, you can't stay here anymore because of what you've done." And so Abram could have had a wonderful moment of testimony, but instead he ruins it. And unfortunately, as we've already seen, this is not the first time that he's going to lie to protect himself because of his wife's beauty. I don't know about you, but he should have counted himself lucky and said, "Look at this woman that God has blessed me with, and from this woman I'm going to get a great nation." But he did not have that kind of faith, and so his testimony is damaged with the Egyptians. And so then we come to chapter 13. Abram went out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the south. And Abram was very rich in cattle and silver and in gold, and he went on his journeys from the south, even to Bethel, another place where his tent had been at the beginning. So he goes back. He leaves Egypt. He goes back to the place where he'd come from, back to where he'd builded the altars that were there at the first. And Abram called on the name of the Lord. So he calls on the name of the Lord again, something he should have done in chapter 12 in that second part. And Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. Back then, your wealth wasn't just measured in the amount of silver and gold you had, but in the number of animals that you had. During this time period, animals were far more useful and far more valuable than even gold and silver. Some civilizations had set up at this point currency exchanges where certain products were worth a certain amount of gold or silver. But in a lot of these nomadic tribes, gold and silver were kind of useless. I mean, you couldn't eat gold and silver, and you couldn't. If you were a nomad, it's not like you could just walk down to the local store and buy something with it. It was heavy. Also, gold is one of the heaviest minerals on the planet, and so if you're a nomadic tribe, you got to carry that around with you, which means you got to have more animals to be able to carry it around. So wealth was often measured in animals. Now, Abram did have gold and silver, as well as great flocks and herds, as well as a massive army of servants to be able to take care of the animals for him. He couldn't have done it on his own, and he certainly had no children at this point. And Lot also was very successful as he followed Abram along. And this goes back to God's promise to Abram in verse 12. "I will make of thee a great nation, I will bless thee and make thy name great." Okay, God is making him great. In fact, he's so great that him and Lot can't live in the same place anymore. Land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdmen of Abram's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled then in the land. So we have Abram and his massive amount of wealth that's moving along, his massive amount of living wealth. You have Lot, who also had a massive amount of wealth at this point. And then you also have the people who are living in the land, and they had their own wealth. And so the land is just not able to support everyone that's together because of all of the blessings that God had given them. And bear in mind, this land had just come out of famine too. Usually it takes a while, 1 or 2 more growing seasons for a land to be able to recover from having a famine. And so I'm sure there was already shortages because of the famine, and then Abram and Lot come in, and things just get worse, and they start to, or the herdsmen start to fight one with another for fields, for the grazing, for water, I'm sure, and for other things. So Abram comes to Lot. He's not yet a great nation, but you can see he's becoming one for sure. He's certainly got the wealth of a nation. So Abram and Lot's people strive one against the other at this point for resources. The land can't support them for the vast amount of resources that they have. Abram said unto Lot, there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdsmen and thy herdsmen, for we be brethren. Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if thou depart to the right hand, then I will go to the left. So Abram says, all right, let's compromise here. I don't want there to be strife between us. We're family. And in Middle Eastern culture, there is a lot stronger of a bond of family than we have here in Western culture. In Western culture, it's very families often separate, and I'm kind of in that boat. My dad was in the military, and so we moved around all over the world, and so I don't have a very close bond with my extended family at all. I'll talk to them on occasion, and I'll see how things are going. But some people talk about the close relationship they have with their grandparents or with their aunties and uncles, and they talk about how we're coming up on Thanksgiving, and there's going to be this massive family dinner, and cousins and aunts and uncles and grandparents are coming from all over the place together. I didn't really grow up with that because it was kind of hard when you're living all the way on the other side of the world. To have a giant family reunion. So a couple times I've been to family reunions, I felt very much like a stranger because I hadn't seen these people, and they're talking about things that I had no idea what was going on. And that's pretty commonplace as I talk to some of the others of my generation who they go to college and then they just kind of separate. There's not really this tight family bond. They love their family, they don't hate them or anything like that. It's just in a Western society, in our Western culture, we kind of just have this idea of independence, an independent spirit where, even I'm going to separate from my family. But in the Middle East, that's not so. You'll have generations living together for a long period of time. And one of the worst punishments that can happen is to exile a family member and to say, you can't have anything to do with us anymore. So understand that this was probably not an easy thing for Abram to say, where he just says, all right, you know what, let's just split up. I'm sure it was a hard thing to say, but practically speaking, the two of them could not live close together anymore. He says, look, we can't keep fighting like this, so the best thing for us to do is to separate, and this is his solution. He leaves it up to Lot. He says, Lot, look, if you go one way, I'll go the other. If you go that way, I'll go the other way. And it's interesting because, again, remember, Lot is Abram's nephew. Abram is in the position of authority as being, I guess you could almost say, the adopted father of Lot. He's not, I don't know if it had been official or anything like that, but certainly he is in an authority. He is in a position of authority over him. And not only that, he could use God's promises on his side and say, look, God promised to make me a great nation. He didn't give you any promises, so I'm going to go my way. Whatever way I pick, you go the other way. But he doesn't do that. He humbles himself and says, all right, Lot, you choose. You pick which way that you are going to go. So Lot lifted up his eyes, and beheld all the plains of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. He looks up and he looks at that valley of Sodom and Gomorrah, and you have it right there. It was like the garden of the Lord. It was Eden, pretty much. This is, he looks at that, and I'm sure it was very tempting. Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan. And that plain of Jordan, that should sound familiar because the Jordan is the river that runs basically straight through Israel. So Lot chooses the promised land. And for good reason. That is the land that God promised Abram. It was going to be the land that the children of Israel would come to after their time in Egypt. It was a good land. It's what God had promised. And Lot looks up and he says, I'm going to choose there. Now some people say, well, this is selfish of Lot. I don't know. It doesn't say his heart here. He could have just looked up and said, that plain of Jordan, that's going to do really well for me and my family. And he could have been thinking selfishly. He could have just said, well, Abram gave me the choice, so if he's going to give me the choice, I'm just going to take this side because it's clearly the best. I don't know. I don't know if this is Lot sinning and selfishness, if this is just Lot being practical. I have no idea, but he looks up, he sees this amazing plain, and he says, I'm going to go that way. Um, so Lot chose them all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and there pitched his tent toward Sodom. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. So Lot makes what would seem to be the obvious choice. I mean, if you're going to be given a choice between good or best, I'm usually going to choose what's best. I'm not necessarily going to choose what's good, especially if it's being freely offered. I mean, if someone says you could have this $100 bill in my left hand or this $1 million check in my right hand, most of us are going to say, and with no strings attached, most of us are going to say, well, we'll take the $1 million check. At least I would, because I'm going to be thinking, okay, what can I do with all this? How can I support my family and things like that? So this is the obvious choice for Lot to make. Was it the wrong one? Certainly, as we'll see later on, this choice did not go well for Lot. And he starts moving towards the city. He's got these huge flocks and herds, but the city life starts to call to him, and so he starts pitching his tent towards Sodom. In spite of their reputation, these men were known to be wicked and sinners before the Lord, but he starts going in that direction anyways. Do I think that he could have dwelt in the plain of Jordan without falling into sin? Absolutely. If he had followed after God, I mean, think about it. If Abram had gone there, would the story have turned out the same? Probably not. But Lot, in his manner and in his, is drawn by the temptations that he sees down there, and certainly that's going to create problems in the next chapter and even later on. So was it the wrong choice? I don't know. It was certainly the obvious choice. It was definitely better. It may not have been immediately the wrong choice, but the choices that came after he made this choice certainly led him down a wrong path. And that's something that we as Christians also need to be careful with. As God blesses us, as we receive blessings, we need to be careful and not let the blessings rule over our lives. I am sure that Lot could have lived in this land without falling into temptation and without ending up in the gate of Sodom. I'm sure he could have done so. And in fact, he is in he is called righteous Lot. He did have a good heart in him, but he got distracted by the blessings that he had. And that certainly ended up causing him a great deal of suffering later on. As we'll see, I'm not going to spoil it too much. But I think he could have made right choices and still gone this direction. If he had been, sometimes we say, well, if he had been respectful to Abram, he would have let Abram go this direction, and maybe that's so. I don't know. The Bible doesn't condemn Lot for going this direction. It does condemn him for the choices he made after he went this direction, but it doesn't condemn him for going this direction. And certainly Abram is just as blessed. It said, Lord said unto Abram, verse 14, after that Lot was separated unto him, lift up thine eyes, and look from the place where thou art, northward and southward, eastward and westward. For all the lands which thou seest, to thee will I give it. Okay, that includes the place where Lot just went. And to thy seed forever. And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. Arise, walk through the land in the length of it and the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee. Then Abram removed his tent and came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and there built an altar unto the Lord. So God gives Abram, or yet another promise, or at least he reiterates the promise that he had already made to make him into a great nation. He says, look, nobody's going to be able to count how many people are going to be coming from your nation. It's going to be as the dust of the ground. And so this is, obviously, Lot made the obvious choice, the well-watered plain of Jordan, but I don't think the land that Abram got was shabby. I don't think it was necessarily the worst either. It's just, it wasn't the best, but God says, look around you, look every direction. All of this is going to be yours, and surely as you move through the book of Genesis and as we look in Exodus and the rest of Hebrew history, God would fulfill this promise. He wouldn't fulfill it in the day of Abraham, but he would eventually fill it through his descendants. So So we're going to see some of the ramifications and some of the consequences of Lot's choice starting next lesson. So thank you for your attention, and hope to see you next week.